Hello class, this is Dr. Branch. I want to share with you a few ideas from When Helping Hurts, chapters 7 through 9. We'll be discussing some of the high points, lots of information here, so I'm going to only hit the most important points. First of all, your textbook tells a great story about an African elder in a village who was a Christian talking with a Christian missionary, and this African elder said that sometimes doing missions with Americans is like dancing with an elephant. And the idea is that the elephant gets to dancing and stomps all over the poor mouse and doesn't even realize it. I think that's a great picture of how many people in materially poor countries view our help. When we show up to help, we are like a giant elephant romping around and stomping on everything, and it's inconsiderate and unkind. So it's a lot like dancing with an elephant. So short-term missionaries have increased dramatically, if not exponentially, over the recent decades. And they can be defined as short-term missions as 1 week to 2 years. And I have these pictures of these ugly tourists here to try to help you get into your mind how some people view missions as just tacky. It's kind of an excuse to go on a vacation in the name of Jesus. So I call these tour missions or evangel venture tour, things like that. And that can be quite problematic. When we go overseas, let's talk about some different views of time. Monochronic, this is how we here in the West view things, is time is a limited and valuable resource, thus our saying, time is money. It can be lost or saved, and good stewardship of time means we get the most out of every minute. And again, this whole idea of time is money here in the USA. But in polychronic cultures, time is a somewhat unlimited resource, at least it's viewed that way. And from their perspective, there's always more time, and schedules and plans are guidelines, and tasks often take a back seat to forming and deepening relationships. This is common in Mexico and in Africa. Also, I jokingly say among some teenagers. But if you understand this chart, how different nations view time, if we at least have this in our mind before we get there, it can keep us from acting like the elephant in the room that stomps all over everyone else. And what I would say is that to a certain degree, the monochronic view is, I suppose this is my own cultural bias, but the fact is all of us are going to die someday, so we only have a limited amount of time in life. Now, there's always more time until Jesus comes, I suppose, but at the end of the day, we want to try to respect other cultures and recognize that if they have a different view of time, try to, as best we can, adapt to that when we arrive there to do missions with them so we won't be running around like an elephant. What this means is in some cultures, if we say we're going to meet at 5 o'clock, that means anywhere between 4 and 6, whereas Americans think 5 o'clock means 5 o'clock on the button. So you just have to keep those ideas in mind. Different views of the individual. Americans in the West tend to be more individualistic. That's why we have things like an MVP award. Collectivistic cultures focus on really the well-being of the group. They minimize individual identity. So the big point is Americans don't always appreciate these differences, either in the views of the individual or the views of time. And again, if we keep this in mind before we go on a short-term mission trip and coach ourselves up, it will keep us from acting like the elephant in the room, to be more respectful if they just have a different view of the individual and the culture in time. So let's talk about effects of the short-term missions on the materially poor. So Mexico is the most popular destination for short-term mission trips in the United States, though there's been some pushback on that with the recent drug wars along the border. But here's the central wrong assumption. It's poverty as deficit. So when Americans who have everything are exposed to traumatic third world poverty for the first time, their immediate observation is, I have stuff they don't have. I have a color TV and a nice automobile and an air-conditioned house, and they don't have these things. And so they immediately assume that poverty is due to the fact they just lack something and I've got to give them stuff, and that's what we tend to do. However, remember this from chapter 2? Do you remember this definition? If we have a material definition of poverty, plus God complexes the materially non-poor, that is the Westerner doing the mission trip, then the people to whom we're ministering already have feelings of inferiority. What results is harm both to the materially poor and the non-poor. Do you remember this? So we have to coach our folks up before they get there that their primary poverty is not really that they lack stuff, though certainly clean drinking water and and latrines and sewers and things are basic necessities. But here's what we expect as well. Short-term missions want to do all this giving within 2 weeks. That makes it even worse. We show up like Santa Claus and just dump things on people and then leave, which is quite problematic. So short-term missions and the relief, rehabilitation, development continuum. Do you remember that from the previous lecture where we talked about those 3 different stages? Usually, most of these people are not in need of immediate relief. What they need is rehabilitation and development, but it's just easier to do relief in a short period of time, right? So short-term missions rarely get the diagnosis correct and often pursue a relief approach when really rehabilitation or development is needed. And that's somewhat driven by our Western desire to get things done. We want to produce results and show that we got things done. So even when relief is needed, it is even better if local ministries take the lead. And so what would be better if we find some way to plug into local ministries to the materially poor in these third world countries where we can help them with rehabilitation and development. So let me go ahead and move past a few things. Let's talk about some suggestions for improving short-term missions. Have a good design. Make sure your host understand poverty. Before they even go there, make sure that they have this different views of poverty in their mind. Do you remember the graph that's going to be on the final exam with the different types of poverty that are out there and how we can have a poverty of community, a poverty of being, a poverty of relationship with God? So they want to have that big picture in mind. And here's the key question before we go. Have you been requested as part of their plan? And the there right there means the third world nationals are the folks working with the materially poor. Do they already have a plan in their country, and are we coming to assist them? That's better, is if they already have a plan and we're going to assist them with rehabilitation and development. Be open to not sending the team. There may be times when you just say, in the name of Jesus, no, we don't think you guys are ready for a short-term missions team, and we think we would do more harm than good. And don't trample on the poor just to get moving. Sometimes we have to say, well, we just have to do something, but what if we're doing the wrong thing? So recruit and screen, and this is where I want to be careful. They say not so much a go help and save them. However, if they're lost, we do want to carry the gospel news that they are lost and they need to be saved. But we also want to stress that we're going as a learner. That the assumption is you're already working with some Christian nationals in that country, and so you're learning from them how they live out their faith in that environment. And don't make the emphasis on the sacrifice that the short-term missions team is making. Oh, I've given up a week of vacation. Oh, it cost me $2,000. No, don't make it there. Don't make the focus on adventure and fun. This is not another way to have a vacation in the name of Jesus. Don't say if you're serious about missions, you will go. And the implication is that 2 weeks means that you are sincere. And one of the things you want to ask is, are potential team members already active in other areas? Are they already vibrant Christians? So if someone is not really involved in the life of the church and then suddenly they have a desire for short-term missions, perhaps we should stop and ask a few questions. So you want to train them, and you want to have pre-trip, on the field, and post-trip components where you help them get ready to go, what they're going to do there, and then debrief them when they get back. Funding: require every member of a short-term mission team to pay for a portion of the expenses from his or her own profit. Your textbook says learners are more likely to value their training if they're paying for a portion of it. Dr. and Mrs. Branch have been asked many times by young people who were rude and impolite to us and barely gave us the time of day at local churches, and then suddenly, when they wanted to go on a mission trip, they started pestering us for funds. And so if you want to know what we do with requests for funding from young people who have bad manners, who have not taken the time to be polite to us, that's what we do with those requests for funding. They go in file 13. So it is typically best not to support an indigenous pastor of a church. This can undermine the congregation's responsibility to pay the pastor's salary. Dr. Hadaway here has suggested the same thing to me. And Dr. Hadaway said what happens is sometimes when Westerners start supporting the indigenous pastor, it actually gives him a higher standard of living than everyone around him, and can create a social distance between him and the congregation. So just give that word from Dr. Hadaway. And remember, people can be won to Christ on these evangelistic efforts. Don't be afraid to share Jesus with lots of people. That's never wrong. Always witness and give out gospel tracts and New Testaments and Jesus videos and all those things. Let me say a quick word about poverty in the USA. Suburban poverty tends to be more in pockets, and so what happens as our country has become more suburban, you have wealthy homes, and then you'll have a trailer park over here with a pocket of poor people, or you'll have a government-subsidized apartment complex over here with a pocket of poor people. So when they're pocketed like that, they're somewhat less visible. And many of the urban poor, your textbook doesn't talk about this, but this is true in Kansas City in particular, many of the urban poor move to the suburbs because of the systemic problems in inner city schools. These folks understand that education is central to their kids getting ahead, so they want to come to these communities. Listen, there's been a loss of decent paying blue-collar jobs. The mill, for example, in the southern United States, there used to be mills in almost every town, spinning mills that made cloth and fabric, and those are almost all gone. So there's been a loss of decent, low-paying jobs. I don't want you to miss this. In fact, according to one study, not only did America lose 5.7 million manufacturing jobs in the early 2000s, but the decline as a share of total manufacturing exceeded the rate of loss in the Great Depression. Now, they're talking about a particular sector of manufacturing, not the entire economy, but that particular sector has had a more steep loss in jobs than those even during the Great Depression. So here's a great paragraph, and I want you to keep in mind from your textbook. The job opportunities and wages for blue-collar workers in such sectors are lower than they were in traditional manufacturing jobs. Hence, blue-collar workers in North America are getting squeezed, and this trend is likely to continue and even accelerate in the coming decades. Moreover, the interconnectedness of the global economy is creating increased volatility. That's especially true. So all these jobs that used to, someone could buy a little brick ranch and they could get by, a lot of those have disappeared and they have gone south. What people mean by that is they moved to south of the border, or they moved across the Pacific to China. So the jobs that are available for blue-collar workers now don't pay as much as the ones did 30 and 40 years ago. It's really caused a huge problem. This is example Sibley Mill, and that says August, that should say Augusta, Georgia. Opened in 1880, closed in 2006. And this is just a symbol of these jobs where you never got rich, but you know what? You could get by and support your family. Those jobs have disappeared. This is a country song which I think gets that idea across. And I don't want you to miss this. This guy says, I gave my last job everything before it headed south, took the shoes off my children's feet, took the food out of their mouths. And here's what he says. Yesterday my folks offered to help, but they're barely getting by themselves. I got a strong back, steel toes, are rarely calling sick. What I don't know, I catch on real quick. I work weekends if I have to, nights and holidays. And here's a guy begging for a job, and he's willing to work, but the jobs just aren't there. So I don't want us as Baptists to forget that 100 years ago, about all these mill workers were members of Baptist and Methodist and little Presbyterian churches all across the South, and we dare not write off those people. I'm a little worried that we as Baptists, where we used to reach out to blue-collar mill workers and coal miners and sharecroppers, we've gotten so educated and sophisticated, I'm not sure we know how to reach out to people in that working class anymore. So this is one of the key ideas that comes out of your textbook for helping people here. They've got to learn wealth accumulation. I'm not talking about greed, but they have to learn how to save money. Income is the flow of revenue that a household receives from its wages, interest, and dividends. And we have to teach these folks how to conserve and save money, because this volatile job market, there's going to be times where they're unemployed, and they're going to have savings for those times. And if we're not teaching them that, they're setting themselves up for failure. It's a part of Christian discipleship in this world. Proverbs 22:7, rich rule over the poor, the borrower is servant to the lender. We want them to stay out of debt. So all these things that we're saying here, the process of saving and managing wealth develops positive attitudes and self-discipline that they're going to need to make it in this environment. And the blue-collar workers need a buffer in order to survive when they get laid off. And so remember, usually poor people are the first to get laid off, and they have the fewest resources. We've got to teach them how to save and accumulate what wealth that they can. So I would also point out to you that for the suburban poor, housing and health care are extreme burdens. The Obamacare has had mixed reviews. We don't know how that's going to work out in the long run, but what I would remind you is there's no free lunch. Somebody's paying for all this, and so this funding is coming from somewhere. So just a quick word about microfinancing. This is an idea that is in your textbook in Chapter 9. I'm going to want you to know about it on the final and just to be aware of the key ideas associated with microfinancing. But the basic idea is lending people in third world countries $20 or $30 or $40 to help them get started with an indigenous business that earns them a bit of money. So there's lots of difficulties associated with microfinancing, but I want you to be aware of the basic ideas associated with it for the final. I hope this has been of some help with you as you review these central ideas from this week in Wealth and Poverty.